So I'm going to get started right away. Last time I had very good news. Last time I talked about how, even though we normally think of the system, so to speak, not done very much in favor of women, and it's kind of, the women tend to be at a disadvantage when it comes to the halachic system. And last time, I should say, 2 weeks ago, I showed you actually a model of where an exception to this rule, right? Rabbi Gershom comes along and says, even though from a halachic Torah perspective, a woman has no agency when it comes to divorce, that's wrong. That's not okay. We have to change that. And we have to kind of give women agency as well. So even though a woman has no agency and she has no say in the divorce, it's not fair, and we have to kind of change that. And he gives women agency in a divorce, right? So even though halachically you can't divorce a woman against her will, Rabbi Gershom says a woman has a say, and unless a woman agrees to be divorced, you're not allowed to divorce her, right? So that was last time's shiur, and that was very good news. Unfortunately, this time I don't have such good news, because unfortunately this time I want to share with you actually something in the other direction, something in the system that actually turned out to be extremely, extremely difficult and putting women at a terrible, terrible disadvantage. I was thinking about it that I should have flipped it, because last time when I taught was during the 3 weeks, so I should have given the bad shiur during the 3 weeks and the good shiur now after Tisha B'Av when we're celebrating in a better mood. But anyway. This is the way it ended up being. What's even more frustrating for me is that the villain, so to speak, and I don't mean to call him a villain, but the anti-hero in today's shiur is actually one of my favorite people in tradition, and that is Rabbeinu Tam, right? Rabbeinu Tam is Rashi's grandson. Rashi's grandson, Rabbeinu Tam, who is famously every page of the Gemara, every page of the Talmud. And in general, Rabbeinu Tam tends to be kind of, so to speak, more inclined in favor of women. There's even this whole kind of tradition that, Rashi and his family grew up among a lot of women, and because of that, they tend to be more inclusive or more accepting, whatever. But in this case, that's not the case. And that's actually a very, very sad case, because, I'm 58. I'll be 60 in 2 years. And actually, this is something that I've discovered only about a year or two ago. I was not aware of this particular sugya. And to be honest, I'm still grappling with it, because it is really so, so troubling and so, so difficult. And hopefully we'll grapple together. Okay? So that's kind of, the framing of the shiur. The framing of the shiur actually is the story of what makes it even harder for a woman to get a get. And, I'm going to put it out there. And again, I don't want to be, disrespectful or irreverent. Rabbeinu Tam turns out to be a huge obstacle in agunot's ability to get a get. Kind of a sad story and a hard story. And I'll give you a little bit of the story and a little bit of the kind of subsequent outcome of what happened afterwards. Okay? So let's get started. Here we go. Okay, let me share with you the document. I'm getting the looks. I'm trying to really balance this kind of talk quietly, but also don't make that comfortable to me. But I'm getting looks. So anyway, can you see my sheet?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the sugya, the place where this happens, is a sugya that's called ma'us alai. That's the sugya. Anybody want to translate what the word ma'us alai means?
Ma'us, you said?
Ma'us, yeah. Mem
It looks like a yud.
And a mem, it's a typo. It's a ma'us. Mem aleph yud samach. Anybody want to translate what ma'us alai means? Anybody?
Ma'us, does that mean like it's a burden for me?
Worse, right? Ma'us means disgusting. So that's the sugya. There's a sugya in the Talmud called ma'us alai, which is the idea of what happens if a spouse says, "I can't take it anymore. I don't want to be, what I need to be." And that sugya has a theme which is called the mored or the moredet. Mored or moredet means the rebellious לקחת את אני מנסה, אולי אתה יכול להזיז. אני מלמד בחוץ בסדר. אתה צודק לגמרי, אולי אפשר לנסות להקים את לעצמו קצת, טיפה. אולי. Welcome to Israel. Be yelling at us. Okay. So basically, the sugi is the sugi of moredet. Moredet and mored means that what happens if a wife rebels against the husband? She doesn't want to do what her responsibilities are. She doesn't want to be intimate, or vice versa. If a husband is mored, and a husband doesn't provide, a husband doesn't want to, be intimate. So that's called a mored or moredet. And there's a whole discussion in the Mishnah which says that in such a case, we impose a penalty on the spouse. A monetary penalty, right? If the husband says, you know what, I'm not going to work, every week we impose that a $50 penalty, a $75 penalty, a $100 penalty, so on and so forth. Same vice versa for the woman. If the woman doesn't want to do her responsibilities, we impose a penalty on the spouse. That's the sugi of mored. Okay, that's the background information. At the end of the sugi of mored, there's a one line in the Gemara, and that becomes the basis for the whole guna issue, because there's a big machloket on how to interpret this line, and I want us to pay close attention to this line. Rambam has one interpretation, which ends up being, so to speak, to the benefit of women. Rabbi Tam has a different interpretation, which has become a primary obstacle in the aguna conversation. Okay, so I want us to pay close attention to this one line in the Gemara. The Gemara says as follows: Heicha damya moredet. What is a case of moredet? I'll translate. Amar Amaymar said, the Amra be'inalei umetzarenalei. The woman says, I want a divorce. I don't want to leave him, Chaz v'shalom. I want to stay married. I want to kind of make it miserable for him. That's the case of moredet, right? When the woman says, you know what, I'm not going to cook dinner, it's a case of a woman who says, I have nothing personal against my husband, but, he upset me last week. I'm going to show him who's boss. I'm not making dinner. Or vice versa. A husband who says, I'm very happy in the marriage. I mean, I don't want to leave the marriage, but, I'm upset. Last week, my wife insulted me. I'm not going to work for 4 weeks. Why am I going to write parnasa for 4 weeks? Let her provide for herself. That's the case that we're talking about in this Mishnah. In such a case, we impose a penalty on the wife or on the husband, a monetary penalty. Aval, the Gemara says, Amra ma'us alai. If she says, I'm simply disgusted, I just physically, emotionally, and mentally cannot be with him, and this is important. Lo kefinan la. We don't compel her to stay. Right? Meaning, so there are two kind of categories. There's a case of a woman who says, I want to stay in the marriage, but I want to make my husband miserable. My husband says, I want to stay in the marriage, but I want to make the wife miserable. Then we impose penalties. But what happens if a woman comes along and says, oh, it's a lie. I just got disgusted. I can no longer be with this guy. In such a case, lo kefinan la, right? Lo kefinan la means we do not compel her to stay. Now, what does that mean? What then happens in the case of a woman who comes to Beis Din and says, lo kefinan la? What do we do? And this becomes the big machloket Rambam and Rabbi, meaning there are two ways of understanding this phrase. What are the two possibilities you can think of? What does that mean? What happens? A woman comes to Beis Din and says, I'm done. I just can no longer imagine myself being with this man. I don't want to be in this marriage. What happens?
Would the next step be to work out the plan for giving a get?
Okay, so let's kind of work with the words lo kefinan la. How would you translate lo kefinan la, Judy? Lo kefinan la means what?
We don't force her to stay in marriage?
Right.
We don't force her to stay in a marriage, i.e., we force him to give a divorce. Right? That would be one way of understanding this phrase. Lo kefinan la. We can't force her to be in the marriage. And since we can't force her to be in the marriage, obviously, the obvious outcome would be, instead, we have to force him to give her a divorce. And that is how the Rambam understands this halacha. Rambam writes very explicitly, beautifully, right? The Rambam writes, V'im amra me'astiha, if the woman says that, I'm so disgusted, Ve'ena yachola lehivaya lo mida'ati, I no longer can see myself being with him intimately, sexually, Kofin oto lehotzi l'sha'ato. We force the husband to give a get. Why? The Rambam says, beautiful language. If a woman is not a hostage, that we can force her to be with someone that she cannot be with. If she says, I am so disgusted, I can't imagine being with him, that is halachic grounds for forcing a husband to divorce, right? I love the language of the Rambam. Again, I was translating English so powerfully. Because she is not like a captive woman who must be with someone she hates. So very simple. According to the Rambam, if a woman comes along and says, this marriage fell apart, this marriage has disintegrated, I no longer can imagine being with my husband as a husband. That's grounds for a get, forcing the husband to give a get. This is so important, right? The Mordechai, an Ashkenazi posek, says a very strong language also. He says, why do we force a husband to give a get in such a case? Shaharei ein benot Yisrael hefker kol kach sheyu meshubadut. I'll translate it in a moment. Liba'el lemi shema'ot lahem. Or the daughters of Israel are not so ownerless that they should be enslaved to have relations with someone who is repulsive to them. Very simple, right? It's a form of enslavement. If this woman comes along and says, I can't, I just simply can't, that is a legitimate grounds for asking for a get, and we indeed force the husband to give a get. There's a beautiful tshuva in the Rashba. The Rabbi says, what does that mean, disgusted? What are the criteria for disgusted? How disgusted and how big and how serious and how fat does disgusting mean? And the Rashba says, what do you mean? She doesn't have to kind of give concrete evidence. Oh, he smells from stinky fish, or I hate the fact that he doesn't brush his teeth. It's a personal, emotional thing. If this woman comes along and says, it doesn't work for me, I tried, I gave it the best shot, and it turns out that it's not okay, that's grounds for divorce, right?
It goes to a local Besdin. How does this theoretically work?
Okay, I'll get back to that in a minute, okay? So the Rashba writes, I didn't translate, but I'm going to translate as I go along. She doesn't give a reason. Well, really, why are you disgusted? Oh, because he smells from fish. Why are you disgusted? Because I hate the way he talks. Let's give a reason. Why is disgusted? Just as people have different tastes in food. And therefore, this woman who says she mois b'nei, and she says, I don't need ketubah. I won't need the forgo ketubah. I don't need his money. I don't need anything. I am in this only for the sole reason that our marriage is disintegrated. Our marriage fell apart. I just no longer see how we can be together. That is legitimate grounds for asking for a divorce. And that was the conventional Jewish community's approach to this issue. In fact, we have evidence that prior to the Rambam, for about 400 years, the Gaonim, Haskind, like the Rambam, that if a woman comes along and says, I'm done, I just don't see how I can be with this man, that is the legitimate grounds to come and ask for a get. And then Rabbi Tam comes along. And I tell my students all the time, Rabbi Tam, and this Gemara and this Sugya, it's in Ksubas Samach Gimel with Beit, with Bet, has a long Tosfos. Look how long the Tosfot is. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I tell my students all the time, when you see such a long Tosfos, you know it's very likely Rabbi Tam making a lot of trouble. And not only does he have a long Tosfot, Rabbi Tam also wrote response, he wrote Shuvot, and he has a Tshuva. Here's this Tshuva. Look how long the Tshuva is. See? A long, long Tshuva on the topic. And Rabbi Tam says, nope, that's not what the Gemara means. A woman cannot request a get based on the fact that she has been disgusted from the husband. And the Rabbi Tam makes 3 arguments. First argument is, he says, let's go back to the Gemara. Let's look at the language again. Remember, what was the language in the Gemara? What did the Gemara say? What did the Gemara
Didn't it say earlier, Kofinala, that you should compel her?
Lo kefinala. Lo kefinala means we don't compel her with penalty and punishment. It doesn't say anything about forcing him. It So where do you have the evidence that we can force him to give a get? The Gemara doesn't say anything about that. The language of the Gemara is specifically focused on her. When she says, I'm disgusted, then we don't impose a penalty, right? Normally, when a woman says, I don't want to make dinner, I don't want to be with him sexually, we impose a penalty. But if she says, I'm not doing it to spite him, I'm doing it because I simply can't, she's no longer punished and penalized. But it doesn't say anybody you can give a get. You don't force a husband to give a get. What does that mean, we force a husband to get? That's number one. Then he makes the second argument, and that is the painful argument. The painful argument that he makes is, he says, number two, we don't trust the women. When a woman comes along and says, I want to leave my husband because I'm disgusted, there's always the chashash that maybe that's not the real reason. Maybe she fell in love with someone else, and because of that, we can give her a get. Because it's nothing about the reality of their marriage. She just fell in love with someone else, and she's not in love with someone else, and therefore we cannot get her a get.
Where does she get that? Where does he get that from?
Let me just finish the third argument, and I'll unpack it. And then the third argument he says is, what are you going to do? You're going to force the husband to give a get? We know in halacha, anything that is done under duress is invalid. So if the husband gives the get under duress, it's not considered a valid get. So how would that be working? So three arguments Rabbeinu Tam makes against this idea of a woman having a right to ask for a get. Number one, he says the text doesn't support that. The text says, lo kafinala only means we don't compel her. You don't have any evidence from the text that we compel him to give a get. That's number one. Number two, maybe she fell in love with someone else. Number three, can you force her husband to give a get? Anything that's done under duress is not valid. What are people's thoughts on this? I can see, Felice, your eyes are rolling. I can see it through the screen. What are your thoughts, Felice? Unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself. You're muted. You're muted, Felice. Felice, we cannot hear you. Felice, we're not hearing you.
You need to unmute, Felice.
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I think it's not fair at all because a woman should have a say, and that should have been established in the beginning.
Okay. And what do you say for hers about his arguments that the text doesn't support it? Maybe she kind of laterized someone else. Third thing is that thing done under duress is not valid. How do you respond to those arguments?
To me, it seems like it's favoring the man.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts? Anybody else?
If what the Rambam has said was the practice, then he is going against, years and years of practice, of practical halacha, and when he said, how do we compel him? He said, well, we've been doing it for years, I mean, what do you mean? How do we compel him? We've been doing it, that's how we do it.
That's what we've been doing. So it must be that there's a good reason why it's valid.
And as I say, I don't know enough about how this also works in terms of who is sort of like considered more authoritative or something like that. But, I've always thought of the Rambam as being, the big wheel, as it were, particularly for Sephardim, but, maybe,
We'll come back to that also. We'll only come back to that in a minute. Any other thoughts? Anybody else? What do you make of Rabbeinu Tam's arguments? The text doesn't support it. Maybe she can have laterized on someone else. Or how can you compel someone? Compelled activity does not work. Anybody? Okay, so I'll come back to that. Here is part 3 of the story. Part 1 is, Rambam says, yes, the way I read the Gemara, it means that a woman can ask for a get. If a woman can come to Beis Din and say, the marriage fell apart, it no longer works, the woman is entitled to get a get, and we force the husband to get a get. That's part number 1. Part number 2 is, then around 1100, sometimes in the 1100s, Rabbeinu Tam comes along and says, no, I disagree. I don't think so. I think actually that that's not what the Gemara means. And in fact, I don't believe that a compelled get is a good get. I don't think a woman can ask for a get no matter what. That's part two. What's sadder? It's part three of the story. Part three of the story is the saddest part of it all, because here is something shocking that happened. We start out having now two strands within the tradition, right? We have the Rambam strand on the one hand, the Rabbi Tam strand on the other hand. As Bert correctly pointed out, one would then think that, okay, perhaps there's a Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide. Sephardim would traditionally follow Rambam, would then assume that a woman can ask for a get. Ashkenazim who follow Rabbi Tam and other Ashkenazi poskim would say a woman cannot get a get. But here is another villain. And I'm saying villain, chas v'shalom. I don't mean to call them villain. I'm just saying the anti-heroes in the story. An anti-hero of the story is the Rosh. Anybody know who the Rosh was, or anything about the Rosh, or when, where, anything? When you hear the name Rosh, does that ring a bell for you? Do you know anything about him? He's one of the most fascinating Rishonim in Jewish history. Does anybody know anything about him? Okay. The Rosh is the 12th century scholar by the name of Rabbeinu Ysoscher. Rabbeinu Ysoscher is an acronym, stands for Rosh is an acronym, stands for Rabbeinu Ysoscher. Rabbeinu Ysoscher is one of the most fascinating Rishonim because he starts out being Ashkenazi, but he ends up being Sephardi because of a fascinating story. His Rebbe, the Maharami Rottenberg, decided to the ends of his life to make Aliyah. He wants to go to Israel. He wants to finish his life in Eretz Israel. Packs his bag, appears for a long time, and eventually starts making the trek to Israel. Now, there were no planes at the time, so to travel to Israel from Europe, from Germany, was quite a long journey. The government gets wind of the fact that Maharam Rottenberg is making Aliyah to Eretz Israel, and the government decides, are you ready for this? That such an act is treasonous. To say that you don't want to live in Germany, you want to instead go to Eretz Israel, that's treason. They schlep him back from his trip, midway in his trip, and incarcerate him for treason, which is a capital crime. The story gets even more interesting. The Jewish community gets wind of the fact that one of their primary scholars has been incarcerated for treason. They're willing to pay a ransom, and the government is willing to accept a ransom. And the Maharam Rottenberg says, I don't let you pay a ransom. Because if the government will find out that when Jews are arrested, they can get money, they're going to keep arresting Jews more and more. I don't want you to pay my ransom. He is 22 years in prison, and he dies in prison. And even after his death, it takes a few years before the government wants to release his body. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Ysoscher, is his primary student. And when they arrest his Rebbe for going to Israel as being treasonous, he decides that staying in Germany is no longer safe. In fact, not only staying in Germany is no longer safe, staying in Ashkenaz is no longer safe. And he runs away to Spain, and he becomes one of the most prominent Spanish Rishonim from Toledo. And it is a fascinating story because he's one of the only Rishonim that bridges that divide. Normally, when we have Rishonim, right, when we have the early medieval Rishonic scholars, we have Sephardim, we have Ashkenazim. The Rosh is one of the only ones who bridges those two worlds. And it's actually quite an interesting story because you have evidence of what happens when he goes from the Ashkenaz community to the Sephardi community. You know, he has a typical immigrant story because originally when he arrives, he kind of says, oh, everything the Sephardim do is bad and everything the Ashkenazim do is great, good, right? And then what happens with the immigrants, as you always know, what happens eventually? Eventually he falls in love with the new culture. And then it turns out actually the new culture is far superior than the old culture, right? You know, I don't know if you have that with the tomatoes, you know, when people make Aliyah, like, oh, the American tomatoes were so juicy and the American, you know, cucumbers were so yummy. And then over time, like, oh, actually, Israeli tomatoes are awesome. Israeli oranges are incredible. With the Rosh, you see that too intellectually. First, he comes and he arrives in Spain, like everything the Spanish Jews do is wrong. And then eventually he kind of comes to return with this Sephardi culture. But for this one halacha. This one halacha, where the Sephardim believe that a woman can ask for a get if the marriage is disintegrated, and the Ashkenazim believe that a woman cannot, the Rosh convinces the Sephardi leadership to adopt Rabbeinu Tam's view on this issue. He basically writes tshuvot. I didn't want to give it to you because I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty. Emphatic tshuvot in which he says, I can't believe that Sephardi rabbis would think that a woman can ask for a get just on the grounds of, oh, I'm disgusted. Rabbi Tam made a very emphatic argument that that should work. I think Rabbi Tam is right. And that is what happens. In fact, apropos of Bort's comment, there's a tshuva from one of the prominent Sephardi scholars who says, in all of halakha, we paskin like the Rambam, except for 3 places, and one of those 3 places is what happens when a woman asks for a get. Even though the Rambam says that a woman can ask for a get, Rabbi Tam says no, and Sephardim adopted Rabbeinu Tam's practice. And I'm going to kind of tell you the epilogue of this story in a minute, but to me, this is one of the biggest mysteries in halacha. And I've been studying this for the last 6 months. I've been looking into this. For the life of me, I can't figure out why is it that when it came to this halacha, Sephardi poskim decided to adopt Ashkenazi practice and deny what the Rambam think is a right that a woman has. I don't know what it is. You can't explain it. It makes no sense to me. If you have any explanation that can make sense, why is it that something that makes a lot of sense should somehow lose its stature, lose its power? I don't know. And if anybody has any thoughts, please share this with me. Any idea what happened?
One thought.
Yes.
Was there such a thing or idea, but probably not, as marital counseling? The rabbis do any kind of counseling to try to help the family, restore whatever they had?
So that's a very good point, Jody. Even though the Rambam says that a woman can ask for a get, the Rambam still says the Beis Din is encouraged to try to kind of get Shalom Bayit. If the Beis Din has come to the realization that after all the attempts for Shalom Bayit, it is now possible, then we can go ahead and give a get. But you're right. It shouldn't be like, oh, anytime someone shows up and says, oh, it doesn't work. Okay, fine. Well, marriages don't work always. Sometimes we have to work hard on it. That's okay. If Beis Din has come to the realization that this marriage no longer works, then Beis Din can force the husband to give a get. But that makes it even more complicated because Rabbi Tam believes that even in such a case, we don't force the husband to give a get. So that's what's kind of so out here. Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
Is there anything that you said there were 3 things that they don't paskin? Do the other 2 have anything in common with with this particular one?
You don't even know what the other 2 are. That's what's so shocking.
Oh, you don't? I thought you knew what they were.
No. It's a tshuva from the Tashbetz. The Tashbetz is a 13th century scholar who says, we always follow Rambam except for 3 things. This is one of them. And I'm like, what are the other 2? Please tell me. It's a good question. I have no idea what the other 2 are. It's really shocking and really surprising. It's really very, very interesting. I don't know what the story is. Yeah. And you know what's even more surprising, and I'll show you, it's going to be a little bit of a trick. I mean, a little bit of a game that I'm going to play with you, but it's a good game because I want to make a point. What do you think the Shulchan Aruch says? What does the Shulchan Aruch say? So let me quote for you the Shulchan Aruch. Here's the Shulchan Aruch. Here's what the Shulchan Aruch says. When it comes to the question of a woman can ask for a get if the marriage fell apart, here's what Shulchan Aruch writes. Nada.
No. I don't see anything.
Not a word. There is nothing in the Shulchan Aruch, which is so shocking to me again, because the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, was obsessed with the Rambam, right? He champions the Rambam, and the Rambam is always right, and we always follow the Rambam because we're Sephardi poskim. For some reason, something happened here where the Rambam lost and Rabbi Tam won, and I have no idea what it is about. Really, it's just shocking. The one thing to understand in terms of what happens with the idea of we can't force someone because anything that's done under duress is not valid. There's actually a very beautiful Rambam who answers that. I want you to read it for yourself, and then we'll discuss it. Take a look at what the Rambam writes. I'll give you the English, and then we'll unpack it. Take a look at it and read it on the screen. You have it on the screen. Can you read it?
No,
Not
it's not.
there yet.
Well, it's not on the screen.
Oh,
It's not
that's
there.
weird.
No.
I thought I shared my screen with you. That's interesting. Let me do it again. Okay. This should do it. Is it now?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay. Can you take a look? Take a look. Read it for yourself.
it's fine. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I've always wondered about this. I was always so familiar.
One second. But before we comment, let me just make sure we're all on the same page on this one. Anybody want to summarize first what Rambam is saying? What is Rambam explaining? How can we kind of force people to give a get? Anything that's coerced doesn't count. Why does it count? What does Rambam say? Very genius, very chash, nice, good. I like it. What does he say?
No, it's
You force him until he says he wants to.
But then he kind of has a big, what is this big chiddush? But why does that work?
because he really wants to give a get because he wants to be a good yid.
Exactly. We all want to be good yidden. We want to do the right thing. The not wanting is not real. The not wanting is just the layer of Yetzer Hara that stops us from doing the right thing. Once we beat out the Yetzer Hara, then the real us comes to the fore. And once the real us comes to the fore, we do what we're supposed to. I love it. It's so funny and interesting. There's a layer of Yetzer Hara. We beat the Yetzer Hara up, to a pulp. And once Yetzer Hara is beat up, now we are good people, and good people want to do the right thing. That's a Rambam's Kiddush. What were you saying, Bert, about it? Bert, you were going to say something that you always wondered about it.
Oh yeah. I've always wondered about, because we've relied on the Rabbeinu Tam. I've always wondered, then how does Rabbeinu Tam deal with this particular thing where he says, in fact, we beat him until because he does actually want to do it. He does want to do the correct thing. So how does the Rabbeinu Tam deal with something like that?
Yeah, so to be fair, the Rambam does not have to accept the Rambam's beautiful idea that actually, really, we all want to do the right thing, and just a few patches, a few beatings will make us do what we need to, it's a nice idea. I'm not saying that it's the right. The Rambam is wrong, but I'm not sure Rabbi Tam necessarily has to agree with it, right? Rabbi Tam could say, no, I don't think so. Anytime anything is done under duress, whether it's a mitzvah or not a mitzvah, it doesn't count. So, so I don't know. So before I give you kind of the plug of this conversation, what are people's final thoughts of what's going on?
Kind of the thought just popped into my head. Didn't we, in essence, to some extent, be coerced if you accept the medrash, the whole Torah, he had mountain on their heads. We'll bury you if you don't.
And said, if you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to crush you to death. And that's why we keep mitzvah, because we were first. Exactly. So to be fair, though, the Gemara does say in Masechet Shabbat that actually the only reason why we keep the mitzvot is because after the miracle of Purim, Jews decided to accept the Torah me'ahava, not me'ones.
Right, which
not
kind of smart that they actually said that you mean to then until Purim, they had rejected the Torah,
right.
they could.
Exactly.
It's just that's dealing with medrash is always tough for that reason.
Right. So final thoughts before I tell you the epilogue to the story. Anybody? Those with the cameras open and those with the cameras closed. Anybody? No thoughts. Okay. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that, for me, this was the big discovery in the sense that, there really is quite a serious solution for the Aguna problem embedded in Chazal. Embedded in halacha, there actually is a relatively reasonable solution, right? Which is, if a woman comes along and says that I have really good reason why this marriage no longer works, even though she can't point to anything in particular, just, the marriage has fallen apart. We no longer are on the same page. We no longer work together. I think I need to get out of this marriage. According to the Rambam, according to Sephardi Psika, for about 500-600 years, there was a good way to get out of that. And unfortunately, Rabbi Tom came along, and the biggest shocker, of course, as you said, is this idea that maybe she fell in love with someone else. What is that all about? And because of the concern that maybe she fell in love with someone else, we shouldn't be allowed to get a get. Because of that, Rabbi Tom says, nope, a woman can never ask for a get. So to me, it just made the whole Aguna story so much more complicated and so much more painful. Because it seems like in the system, there is a solution. But for some reason, history has attributed incredible power to Rabbi Tam. And I don't want to be critical. I'm not meaning to be critical. I just want to describe. And there's things that we don't understand yet from the system. But it seems that for some reason, when it came to this halacha, Rabbeinu Tam somehow was so overpowering. His opinion was so overwhelming that it carried the day to the point where Sephardi poskim, so to speak, suppressed their views, suppressed their opinion, and decided to adopt the Rabbeinu Tam Ashkenazi view. I have no idea what that is all about, right? And Alexander wrote a good question. Can you ask the question, Alexander, or you want me to read it out?
You got to unmute yourself.
So Alexander wrote in the comments, everybody can take a look, but I'll read it. Any discussion about a man falling in love with another woman? Is it assumed that the get would go without saying? So you know the answer, Alexander, right? The answer is that no. When it comes to the man, nobody ever suspects that, maybe there are ulterior motives, maybe there's something else going on, so yeah. Here is the part that's a little bit frustrating. And that is something that we did last week as well, before I get to the epilogue. And that is historical context. Judy is already bobbing her head. So let me just finish the question, and Judy, you're going to speak. Is it possible that historical context could help us understand a little bit of what is going on here? Why is that this big Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide, and what is going on here that we have such a split between two strands within a tradition in terms of whether or not a woman has the power to ask for a get? What do people think? Judy, you were bobbing your head, so I'm calling at you.
I don't know. I'm very perplexed.
What?
I'm perplexed about the Sephardi.
Islam, Christianity.
Just out of
Sephardi.
curiosity, if you go over to a contemporary, the President of America, okay, and you say to them, look, you're looking for ways to, to be able to help the woman. Why don't you paskin like the Rambam? And what would they say to that?
Let me get to that in a second. 1 second. So first of all, Islam versus Christianity. For Jews who lived under Islamic rule, the fact used to be that any married woman who converted to Islam, her marriage was automatically nullified.
Automatically what?
Nullified.
Oh.
The government said they legally can now marry whoever they want from a legal kind of Islamic rule perspective. They're not considered married. So Sephardi rabbis knew they don't have much of a choice. If they're not going to allow a woman who wants to get out of a marriage to get a get, she's just going to convert to Islam. And once she converts to Islam, she's just going to be able to get out of the marriage, and she's going to have the protection of the state. So simply for basic reasons of protecting the community, they needed to respond to this issue. because they knew if they didn't respond to this, the consequences would be far greater. The women are just going to convert to Islam. And in fact, we have historical evidence of women converting to Islam by means of getting out of a marriage. So that's the Muslim context, right? Rabbeinu Tam lives in a very religious Christian context. Christianity looks askance at any form of nullification of a marriage. They think, in fact, that marriages should never be nullified. And in order to not look frivolous or promiscuous for their Christian contemporaries, Rabbeinu Tam had to take away that right of a woman to just ask to get out of a marriage because the marriage fell apart. And was it directly the reason Rabbeinu Tam gave? No, Rabbeinu Tam gave other reasons. Oh, because maybe he fell in love with someone else. Maybe this, maybe that. In the back of his mind, consciously or perhaps subconsciously, there was this fear that if the Goyim get wind of this permissiveness, what would that do for our standing among our non-Jewish brethren? And that always is something that we need to think of halacha. To what degree do subconscious cultural realities inform and influence the halachic system? And what does that mean? I don't mean to be critical. Again, I love the halachic system, don't get me wrong. I live halachically, I keep halach and all that. But it's an interesting thing to think of. What do we do with halachot that have now become normative, but we know as a fact came about at least partially because of a local contemporary cultural phenomenon? Because that is what we're dealing with, right? Rabbeinu Tam is a posek. And Rabbeinu Tam paskins that if a woman says, I want to get a divorce from my husband, we don't force the husband to get a get. That's the psak of Rabbeinu Tam. But we do know, either consciously or subconsciously, a local cultural phenomena informed Rabbeinu Tam's thinking. I'm not saying that it was definitive. I'm not saying it was dispositive. He did it because of that. It definitely was a factor, given of the fact that Sephardi poskim said otherwise. Why do Sephardi poskim say otherwise and Ashkenazi poskim say otherwise? Presumably because they live in different cultural milieus. What do we do 800-900 years later when that cultural reality no longer exists, but we're still there with that halachic reality? And how do we kind of address this halachic problem with integrity and systematically? That's the big challenge that halacha faces. What do we do when halacha is written in the books? The halacha in the books is a woman can never, ever, ever ask for a divorce. That's the halacha, right? That's the halacha. But we know the history of the halacha. And once we know the history of the halacha, we know it came about at least partially because of a cultural reality that is no longer our reality. What do we do with that? That is the $1 million question that poskim today grapple with, trying to figure out ways to fix these halachic challenges with integrity, authenticity. And that's the challenge. And that's the thing that the Beis Din of America is doing, that Rabbi Simcha Kras tried to do when he started the Beis Din for Agunot with Lou Grimberg, and now he's continuing with, I'm forgetting his name, from Rhode Island, who runs it now. But anyway, so that the other thing to know is the prenup agreement. Okay, so do people know what a prenup agreement is? What do people know about a prenup agreement, Judy?
I wish I had had one. My first marriage, it was a divorce.
Oh, wow.
I did not have a prenup. It was rather challenging. Anyway, so but the prenup is before you sign the ketubah. Before the husband signs the ketubah, the two people agree that either one who is asked for, whether it's the woman asking the husband or the husband asking, agree to not to stop the progression of the divorce.
And the most important piece is, and if the opposing side refuses to give a get, they willingly accept upon themselves a financial penalty. They willingly accept upon themselves a financial penalty. That's a big chiddush with a prenup agreement. Prenup agreement is basically meant for the husband. The husband, when he gets married, signs, I willingly allow the Beis Din to impose a huge financial penalty for me if the wife comes to Beis Din and says, for a good reason, I think we need a divorce, and I refuse to give a divorce. Beis Din comes to the conclusion that this marriage needs to be ended, and the husband refuses, then I am willing to accept a financial penalty. What's the trick here? What's accomplished here? What is the chap here? Anybody?
It kind of might urge them to try to seek help to try to resolve the problem.
But also, how does it solve Rabbeinu Tam's problem with a compelled action is not valid? How do we solve that problem? Think about it. How do we address the problem? Rabbeinu Tam says anything that's done under duress is invalid. It's also under the duress of financial duress.
Well, this becomes more of an option. It's more of an option.
So it's not
He
duress.
agreed to it. He said, I give you the right to force me to give a get, and if not, to impose a penalty on me. So once he accepted it a priori, it's no longer a get under duress. You committed to do that. In fact, the last thing I'll say about that, and I'll answer Bert's question, and then we'll wrap up, is that the way it works is that we actually don't just impose a financial penalty, we impose an exorbitant amount of alimony. So it's not even kind of a financial penalty, we just impose a money penalty. We just say, you know what? You agreed to pay $10,000 a week for food and sustenance for her because you agreed to it. And once you agree to that, it is no longer considered a forced get, and therefore it's valid. To be fair, the Haredi community has not accepted that because the Haredi community says, wink, wink, come on. It is compelled, right? He agreed to do that because they didn't think it's ever going to come to divorce. Now that it has come to the divorce, he is not happy about it. And if it's not happy about it, it's considered still under duress. And that is now the big dividing line between the modern Orthodox community and the Haredi community on this issue. In fact, just 1 second, Bert. In fact, Chovevei, and I think now even YU, I'm not 100% sure, I have to check about YU, but Chovevei students are not allowed to perform a wedding if the couple has not signed a prenuptial agreement. Our students are told, if you are invited to do a wedding, you have to check and make sure that the couple has signed a prenuptial agreement. If you have not, Rabbi Linzer does not allow a Chovevei graduate to perform such a wedding. And I think YU has a variation of that. But I do have to say that this is something that the Haredi community has fought against very tough and very harshly. In the Monothic community, the prenup is universally accepted. Herschel Schachter accepts it. Everybody accepts it. But in the Haredi community, Haredi poskim have very emphatically argued that the moment we do that against the husband's will, the get is again a compelled get. This is where they play a harsh game. Because a compelled get is invalid, that means now that the woman is an Eshet Ish, right? She is married. If she marries again, Chas v'shalom, the kids are going to be a mamzerim. And the Haredi community holds that over their people. This is why no Haredi couple would ever do that, because of the fear, well, God forbid, if the Haredi Beis Din is right, that means the kids are going to be a mamzerim. And that has become the big divide in the community. So that's that. The last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to take a few questions and we'll wrap up, is that Bert asked before, what happens if someone comes along and says, well, if the Rambam paskins like that, can I rely on the Rambam? So in Israel, the Rabbanut sometimes, for Sephardi couples, will still rely on the Rambam and force a husband to give a get even when there's no prenuptial agreement. Because at least Sephardim can argue, look, there was a time within the Sephardi community when Sephardi poskim believe the woman can ask for a get. So it's not universal, but there are times when a Sephardi couple whose marriage has fallen apart, the Beis Din Rabbanut has tried everything they can, and nothing works, the Rabbanut will resort to compelling the husband to give a get based on the Rambam because they're a Sephardi couple. But for an Ashkenazi couple, they'll never do that. Unless there's the prenuptial agreement, they would never force to give a get. So that's the story. That's where we are today. And like I said, I mean, it's not shocking. Shocking is a strong word. It is hard for me because Rabbi Tam is one of my heroes. Rabbi Tam in general is actually very tolerant, very lenient, very, accommodating in halacha. Overall, that's not Rabbi Tam. There's lots and lots of examples, which I can't get into right now, in which Rabbi Tam made life easier, just in general for the Jewish community, for women in particular. Rabbi Tam lived during the Crusades, and a lot of women suffered during the Crusades, and Rabbi Tam made their life easier. Somehow, when it came to this issue, Rabbi Tam ended up on the very conservative end of things, and primarily, the reason why women don't have recourse is because of this opinion of Rabbi Tam. If it wasn't for this opinion of Rabbi Tam, we would have had a Rambam, the Gaonim, who said, if a woman comes and with conviction claims that the marriage has disintegrated, the husband then is forced to give again. So it's a complicated story. Good.
Two things, completely different. One is, this is, that if the person is poor, okay, the husband is poor, then the penalty is meaningless because the person can't afford to pay it,
Right.
Right. But if he's rich, and he could afford to pay it, he still doesn't have to give a get,
Right.
So in that sense, in both ends of the deal, it doesn't work as a practical matter.
Right. I mean, let me just respond to that and I'll take your other question. At the end of the day, there are no perfect solutions. The perfect solution would be when men come to realization that women have a right, just as men do. As Alexander said before, when a man says, I want a divorce, nobody asks, well, is it this, is it that? Is it because you fell in love with someone else? And men hopefully have to come to a place to realize if the marriage fell apart, and it's okay. The best we have for the moment is to impose a financial penalty. And, even when we impose the financial penalty, does it have power in the secular court? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's not a foolproof solution. It's not a foolproof solution, but things are getting better. And, one of the things I have to say is going to be a little bit harsh. So people know that a couple of years ago, Lou Greenberg asked Rabbi Simcha Kraus, Zichron Livracha, to start a Beis Din to help Agunot. And Rabbi Simcha Kraus started doing that. And Rav Ysoscher got wind of that, and he went ballistic. And he basically ripped into Rabbi Kraus, because Rabbi Kraus, for every get that he got through this whole process, wrote a whole tshuva explaining why it is. And Rav Ysoscher ripped apart his tshuvot, his this, his that, and everything else. Rabbi Kraus dies. And, Rabbi Barry Dollinger. Rabbi Dollinger is a rabbi in Rhode Island. He took over from Rabbi Simcha Kraus. Here is something very smart that Rabbi Dollinger did that Rabbi Kraus didn't do. And I don't want to critique Rabbi Kraus. Rabbi Kraus was a dear friend of mine. His wife was my colleague for many years in school. Sometimes rabbis have to learn the value of tzniut. I'll say that again. Sometimes rabbis have to learn the value of tzniut, meaning if you have a heter for a woman who needed a get, there's no need to publicize that for the whole world. Give the heter to the woman, explain to the man why you think she can get a get or why we can force her to give a get, and move on. Rabbi Kraus meant well, but he made a mistake by writing these long, elaborate tshuvot explaining his views, because he exposed himself to hard critique, which Rabbi Dollinger doesn't do. Rabbi Dollinger works completely under the radar. Rabbi Dollinger does not write tshuvot explaining his view. If you want to ask him, call him up, have a cup of coffee with him, and he explain to you why I thought this woman deserves a get, why this husband can be compelled to give a get. One of the mistakes, and I've learned the hard way because I was kind of quite active on social media for a very long time. And, publicize, right? Publicity is not always a good thing. Now, of course, there is a value of publicity because then women know to come to you, women know to turn to you. That's important. But there's also something to be said for tzniut. And I know tzniut, normally we think about, oh, everything women have to do. Sometimes men need tzniut too. And it isn't necessarily how they dress that it doesn't dress. Just don't run around trumpeting your views, trumpeting your opinions. Do it modestly, do it quietly. And it is unbelievable the rate of success of Rabbi Dollinger. Rabbi Dollinger has done miracles. Women who couldn't get a divorce for years and years and years. They went to Rabbi Dollinger. He sat down, spoke to the husband, said to the husband, listen, if you don't do the get, this is what we're going to do, that what we're going to do, this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen, and so on and so forth. And the husbands responded. So that's an important lesson. Last question, but
okay, the other thing is that, when you go to people who say that there's nothing that we can do, and so you say to them, well, Paskin like the Rambam, and their response is,
yeah. So to be a bit,
people say, well, there's really nothing we could do, and but in fact there is. Let's Paskin like the Rambam, and there is something you could do.
So let me be very fair. Let me be very fair and very honest. There's a halachic process. The halachic process is such that we don't go by Rambam or we don't go by Rabbi Tam. We go by Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah both rejected the Rambam. And that ties our hands a little bit because we don't just like Rambam. The fact of the matter is that we don't pass like Rambam, we pass like the Shulchan Aruch. So the question is, can we bring the Rambam back into the conversation in a way that's authentic to the halachic process? That's really the question. Okay. Any final thoughts? Any final comments? Any final observations?
Yes, it would seem like if people are trying to help two people have a shidduch, be important that they find out their attitudes towards this concept.
I will take it one step further. If you love someone, if you have friends, if you have relatives, if you have neighbors, if you have congregants, don't let them ever get married without a prenuptial agreement.
100%.
It is the biggest favor you'll do them in their whole life.
Sure, go ahead.
It makes a huge difference. Now, God willing. What?
Nobody wants to say something.
Go ahead, Gloria.
Hi, Rabbi Katz.
Hey, good to see you.
One of the things that I find troubling with the contemporary prenup is that there's a fair amount of anecdotal evidence where the woman goes to the Beit Din with the prenup and the husband delays and delays and delays. And when he finally wants to do it, the Beit Din says, well, if you renege on the penalties, then the husband will give the get. So the penalties are sort of not helping the woman at all. It's still totally in the husband's hands.
Yep. Again, like I said before, it's not a foolproof system. It's not a perfect system, and in fact, what happens if the husband says, I don't want to pay the penalties? Well, sometimes you can go to court. In some judicial systems, it is binding because it's done through arbitration. Some courts is not. It's notarized. It's not perfect, and there is so many flaws in the system that still need to be fixed and healed. But it is the minimum we can do. It's like what's
on Kedushin al Tanai.
Yeah, so there's a whole nother possibility of Kedushin al Tanai, which we can talk about it next year when you invite me again. Okay, we'll do that next year. That's all not just yeah. Okay, Robert, are you?
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate it. It was great.
Call to everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the summer.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.